Hello, everyone, and welcome to Canadians with Disabilities and Their Allies. My name is Brent Frain. I'm the host, and you can check out the show on Spotify or your favorite app where you find it available. And also, the show is also known as PWD Allies Podcast. Amazing that I actually have my voice somewhat back to normal today after a long hiatus over the weekend where I actually almost lost my voice and I almost sounded like Kermit the Frog there for a while, but I still got a little tickle there and suffering from allergies, and it just drained down there. And I strained my throat by talking super loud on Friday, and I wasn't sure if my voice would be almost back to normal. It's pretty well, I'd say about 99% back. So just left it with a little tickle, but hey, tickle it is. But today I'm actually tickled and thrilled to have John Loeppky.
John Loeppky.
Loeppky.
Oh,
Sorry,
Loeppky.
Loeppky.
Oh,
I
we got door number 1, door number 2, door number 3.
That's all right.
Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, John, for joining me today. And I'm going to direct the conversation right over to my editor producer, and he's going to take it from there. Thank you very much, John, for joining me.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is we can start the show and say we have 3 people with CP on the show. We have myself, we have Ellen, and we have John. So we are taking over. We are taking over your podcast, Brent. How do you feel about that?
Oh, this is awesome because the more the merrier, and I tell you, we come in forces, and we just talk about the lived experience and the stories that come out of it all, and it's so important to get that narrative out there of saying like what people are going through, and diving right into it.
And on the positive side,
yes,
I was going to say on the positive side, one air horn and we'd all be done for. So you'd still have your podcast back.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start and say that you're from Regina, Saskatchewan, and you are a journalist, a freelance journalist, and you've been on AMI with Dave Brown, and you've done articles for the CBC and Globe and Mail, and you've also got a theater group called Listen to This. So, but the reason why it was actually Alan that suggested to have you on, so that's why Alan is actually on, because he was the one that was pushing to have you on. So yes. we wanted to have Alan come on as a co-host, and we wanted to kind of start the conversation, maybe talking about this idea of disability culture. So
sure,
maybe lead us down that path for a bit and talk.
I'll leave you down that hopefully accessible rabbit hole. Yeah. So I'll give you a little bit of. It's not always, but sometimes. I'll give you a little bit of context for that wonderful bio. So yeah, I graduated from the University of Regina with both a BA and eventually an MFA. I actually went to high school here around Saskatoon, where I now live on Treaty 6 territory. But before that, I was born in Britain, so I have lived on multiple continents and have multiple opinions, which will shock no one. Prior to being a freelance journalist, I did work with Listen to This. I still work with them sometimes, but I just want to be clear, I'm not speaking for the organization, but I have been involved over the years. One journalist, 3 disclaimers. And so depending on where we want to go, the disability culture piece of it is, I have a series with CWC, an opinion series called Taking a Sitting Stand. And the idea is to take apart these sort of sometimes difficult to understand notions about disability. So I did one on the CRIP tax, so the extra costs related to disability. I've done one on some work around disability as a culture. I've done some around sort of just lots around unpacking the disabled experience. The other one that I was going to mention is one around cradle to grave care. So this idea that disabled folks deserve and are owed this care from cradle to grave, as opposed to what we get oftentimes. And I am talking to 3 folks with CP, where we get care from 0 to about 17, and then it sort of depends on where we're at in the disability hierarchy as to whether we get any kind of support, particularly from the medical system from there. So understanding disability as a culture, and the piece I talk about disability as being something you are a part of, as opposed to something that just happens to you.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that I don't think disability is something that can be thrust upon you, in a lot of ways, and for a lot of folks it is. But for me, being born with it and coming to understand it as a culture has really helped to frame my life and my work.
Well, one thing I wanted to talk about too, and Alan can touch on this as well. I have done a couple of radio interviews. It's been a while, but I did a couple of radio interviews with public radio. It was called Soapbox Radio, and they were it was for disability advocacy issues.
Sure.
And I was on with one of the radio hosts, and he was saying, like I was talking about this disability expo that is put on in Vancouver sometimes, and I was saying, it's kind of always the same crowd of people. There's not really a lot of new people a lot of the time. And he said his response was, well, that's because disability is not something that you're normally proud of. Like that's what that and he was being like kind of the devil's advocate, right? He was taking the devil's advocate role. He says, well, maybe the reason for that is because with the disability, it's not something that you're particularly proud of. And so I wanted to get both your feedback on that, and as well as Ellen's, and see
Sure.
what you think about that comment.
Sure. I think so. There's this term that is used sometimes, and I'm forgetting in my disability brain fog who came up with the term. It's the leader of NEIS Void, No End in Sight Void, and their community. But it's this idea of stableism. So this idea of like the assumptions that people with, relatively speaking, stable disabilities, as in symptoms might change a little bit, but are not quite as up and down as maybe some others.
Yeah.
Have a particular perception of disability as opposed to others. And I think that I've also written for mental health sites like Very Well Mind about the challenges of being proud of disability. I certainly wasn't always proud of disability. There was a period in my life where I was deeply ableist, particularly around those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I have a sibling with an intellectual and developmental disability, so there was a lot of I'm not that when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I think we bring those biases into our life. And for me, I mean, my Twitter bio says crippled and creative. I'm sort of my politics are, the way I believe of myself as disabled is out there. But I didn't have that from, I didn't have that from, I was going to say the jump, but I can't jump very high, so we won't go there. I didn't have that from zero. And so I think it is sometimes difficult to be proud. The line that I've sort of borrowed and adapted, and I've used it for so long that I can't remember who I borrowed it from in the first place, is I can love my body without loving my symptoms.
Yeah.
And I think that that area of care is sort of where I sit within that.
Yeah.
I happen to come from parasport, which can tend to fly the flag a little bit of we are loud, proud, and by the way, we're
Right.
disabled.
Right.
But I recognize that particularly like if we're looking at folks with long COVID, I've done some reporting around COVID and long
Right.
COVID and sort of the barriers to identifying with disability or feeling like you're part of, whatever the community means in quotes.
Yeah.
Can be really challenging because for a
Yeah.
lot of people, it's not people who conceived of themselves as disabled. And then if you're surrounded by a bunch of voices of like, those with congenital disabilities or, the very sort of high, if you want to call it high profile, like I don't think I'm out of telling tales out of school to say that, the loudest voices in disability advocacy previous to the last maybe 10 years were all white spinal cord injury or congenital disability folks, largely men. So if you continue to see one particular version of disability talked about over and over and over again, it doesn't exactly strike a welcoming tone. I don't think.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's where I sit.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say that now I have the brain now I have the brain fog. But what I was gonna say is that when you have a disability, so much of having a disability, I think especially when you're younger, is you're trying so hard to prove yourself, right? That you're better than your disability, right? So,
Oh yeah, my plan, by the way, when I moved to Canada was to become a hockey goalie.
Okay.
Oh,
Not a
Yeah.
sledge hockey goalie. That
Okay,
would have been
but a
somewhat
legit
sensible.
hockey goalie.
No,
Yeah.
no, I was going to go to the NHL.
Yeah.
Something irrational confidence was sort of the name of the game there.
Life is what happens when you're making other plans.
Yeah,
John
and then
Lennon said it, right?
and then nowadays I realize that I've had an anxiety disorder from very young in my life, and I'm like, oh, where's that irrational confidence? Can I borrow that for like 10 minutes?
Yeah, because I wrote a book. It's called Daddy Bent Legs, and I've mentioned it a few times on the podcast. But like a big part of my narrative in the book is talking about how much in my early upbringing I was trying to avoid my disability, like because I didn't want to have the disability label. I just wanted to prove that I was better than that, right? And I just wanted to get Alan's take on the whole thing. Like, what do you say, Alan?
Well, I think I have a lot in common with John in that my parents were both English professors who came from England in 1967, started in Canada as teachers in a high school. Years later, they became professors in a college, and I came into the world, and I'm like, I spent more time out of Canada from 1972 to 1980 than I did in Canada because my dad's side of the family lived in Wales. My mom's mom, who I was closest to, was in Birmingham. So if we weren't in Great Britain, we were traveling through Europe. In fact, in 1977, we spent a year traveling in a French station wagon through Europe. It wasn't a Citroen, so it wasn't as cool as I was hoping, but there you go. But I think I came back, and the way my upbringing was I was like, how more can I deflect my disability? Like I became I got trained in jiu-jitsu, and I ended up on the wrestling team in high school, which kept me from getting stuck in lockers and bullied because there was a golden rule: you didn't mess with the athletes in the high school. Like you just didn't, right? Like, and because I was a bit of a rocker and I wore jeans and my hair was long and I wore Doc Martens, you also didn't mess with the metalheads. So I was protected in kind of a bubble between the stoners, the athletes, and the headbangers. So even though I wasn't that popular as a teenager at home, my dad said it's that damn drum kit or it's the damn motorcycle. I don't know which is worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so it wasn't really till I was probably in my 20s that any connection to the disability community was so distant for me. Um,
Mhm.
I ended up in an independent living program, but I also got a job there, so I was paid what the regular student staff was paid, which is not the dollar an hour that the clients uh, got paid for their for working in a laundromat or whatever.
Mm.
Um, I was making 12 an hour, and often I was in the supervised situation. And then again, I was also during my 20s running my landscaping company, so
Mhm.
I don't think it was until after my 30s that I really became an advocate in any form.
Mhm.
And I grew up in a family where you didn't get picked on if you did your best, but you got called out if you didn't. If you were slacking, you were
Yeah.
called out for it. You
Yeah.
know, like
Yeah.
like we know you're capable of shoveling the snow, so if the driveway's not shoveled in the winter, we know who to come to.
Yeah.
The
Right.
grass is not cut.
My
You're not
parents
going.
my parents used to make my sister and I do the weeds. We had a whole huge it was the whole property, huge thing of ivy
Mm.
in the front of our house in Burnaby. And we had to weed it all the time, me and my sister. And of course, I mean, when you I could like I had to go down on my hands and knees, and of course hands and knees with cerebral palsy, right? Like I couldn't walk through it. I just had to be down on the ground and trudging through on my hands and knees, and it was like it was bad, but they were always like toughen me up and do stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's a it it's a tough balance, isn't it? Because it's
Yeah.
how do you like I've said about parasport before that like in a lot of ways it saved my life in the way that sort of I conceived of myself as a disabled person. And
Mhm.
yet having not having retired, I always say I got to go to a bunch of cool stuff but never anything important.
Mhm.
It's like, oh, look at those coping mechanisms I was building within that environment of like, you know, I'm I'm above this disability fray in a way. And
Right.
there's lots of people who have unpacked that, lots of,
Yeah.
former athlete artists. I'm certainly not
And
alone in
politicians,
that.
politicians
And
here. Yeah.
politicians.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, well, going back to the inspo point that we were talking about before sort of the cameras turned on, there's a real challenge to talk in disability community, I find, about resiliency
Mhm.
while trying
Mhm.
to get at that, like, because anytime you're asked to do something as a disabled person, it's often framed as like, well, look at them self-advocating. And you're like, yeah,
Yeah,
self-advocating.
it's
Self-advocacy is great to a
Yeah.
point, but do I want to be self-advocating for absolutely everything in my life?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
one
Yeah.
one of the
Look
things
at
that
no.
really
look at how resilient they are at only getting $1,000 a month to live on. That's resilience. You
Yeah,
know.
and
one,
it's sorry, go ahead, Alan.
yeah, no, I was just saying one of the things that really peeved me and that probably even pushed me further away from uh getting involved with the disability thing. I mean, we're talking pre Facebook and
Sure.
TikTok and all that, was the fact that you get these ableist people that thought, oh, he's a great photographer, but what they start out with is, hey, he says that he's a photographer, but he's disabled, and blah, blah, and they would bring the disability to the forefront before anybody got to know me,
Yeah.
Mm,
right? So I'm like, just because I'm not a disabled person with a camera. I'm a person with a camera that has a disability. And
Yeah.
I found this so common weed through with people that didn't have disabilities. I didn't hold them to account because I knew that it was just ignorant based. Not
mm,
There was no malevolence to it. Um, but it caught every time because I would like I just I was involved with an artist. That was one of the reasons I moved to Kingston from Niagara was to be part of her art studio. Um, and but I started realizing that even though she has a disability and disorders and stuff, and I was trying to be accommodating to that. Um, every time she did a live, she would be like, "This is Alan. He's my friend. He's he's disabled, but he's a really good photographer." So this whole ableist. I'm like, do we have to?
Yeah.
Now I
And
definitely don't want to be
it's
on your webcam.
Yeah.
it's such a conflict, isn't it? Because like, one common split, and I've reported on this before, is that a lot of para athletes will use person first disability, first and first language, right? And a lot of activists, sort of capital A activists, will use identity first. And that often creates a split. And it's also, like you said, Alan, not to put too fine a point on our age difference, but it's also a generational thing, right? And I think that, whenever I interview somebody, for example, when the topic is disability, I ask if they prefer identity first, person first, and then I usually say, or some secret third thing. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's just, how we choose to engage with our own disability has more nuance than identity first or person first. It just happens to be a tiny little bow. I think that my experience, if you cut to me being an ableist little kid, I would have probably been totally in the person first camp when people were talking to me. Now, if I have a choice, I'm identity first, but oftentimes this history gets lost, right? Like people get mad about the use of person first language in certain circles without realizing that person first language came out of independent living circles around intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Yeah.
And that will become forgotten. And then people will be like, and then you have to point out that, like, if you're super mad about this, did you go and talk to anybody in those circles? Like,
I've always had a big problem with the definitions and labels. Actually, that's always been, and that goes for everything. Like, for example, like I'm actually pissed off that our Canadian anthem is now like it got rid of "Thy Sons" command. And I mean it kind of pisses me off. And one of the things too is this whole what was the thing that Rick Hansen said? It was a physically challenged. Remember, he came up with the term physically challenged, and it was like, that with that you're kind of trying too hard. Like, why can't you just say I'm disabled? And if you say you're physically challenged, it's almost like well, anybody can be physically challenged. Like you could be like have a couple beer on the couch and not want to get off the couch because you're inebriated, and then you're physically
you can eat an edible muffin.
And so it doesn't. If you say you're physically challenged, it doesn't really address what it actually is. Far better to say, you know what, I have a physical disability, and that's the truth of it, right? And
right.
Like not try to put all these like little pretty language things on it.
I think the difference for me, and we won't go into the Canadian national anthem. I think it's good that it's gender neutral. Maybe we can talk about that after the video. But the one that I think that the principal difference for me, and I'm taking off my journalist hat when I say this, is how I refer to myself is not how I prescribe others to talk about other people, right? So if I use identity first language for myself, that doesn't mean that I think identity first language is the only way to go. And I think that's the hole. I think that's the hole that we fall down in as a community. I also think that when we talk about the term disability community, you'll see it in my writing because it means something, but I think it is meaning less and less in the sense that my disability community in Saskatchewan is going to be radically different from, Burnaby or Niagara or wherever, right? And, my sort of, if you took a poll of my 1,200 Facebook friends, Lord help me, those that are disabled would often fit a similar profile, right? They're probably going to be former athletes. Parasport in Canada is very white and is working towards more diversity than that. There's a number of areas. So the circles that we run in can be sort of radically insulating when it comes to language. And I love pointing to people to things like, and yes, this is a bit of an academic source, but it's not written academically. The University of Minnesota's Critical Disabilities Studies Collective has a great webpage that lays out a lot of these terms, including the really, really academic ones in some great language. So, words are always evolving. And I always say about disability community, often for a community that is uncomfortable with labels, we sure love coming up with them. And that's not like a negative critique. It's a reality. We want to put a name to things.
Yeah.
And then sometimes we think that there's only one term, or people aren't using, sometimes I'll hear from academics and they'll say, we don't use person first language anymore. And I will, I think to myself sometimes, no, your group doesn't. Like the people that you hang around with doesn't. It doesn't mean that the broader people outside of your sort of proverbial front door don't.
Yeah.
Like I know, for instance, like lately, I had to go and change or update some stuff on a medical card in British Columbia. And of course, right away, the representative on the other end of the phone line said, Brent, how did you want to keep everything the same as your identity, or did you want to update it as he, him? And I'm like, what? I'm like, I'm just me. And you notice how there's like he, him, and she, her, and all this stuff. And I said, I'm just me. I don't change nothing. I'm just who I am.
Yeah, I think, but and this isn't me arguing with you, Brent. I didn't come on this podcast to argue, I promise.
No.
And I'm not all that argumentative, though maybe some of my friends would disagree. I think when things like that don't affect us, and I think I'm connecting this to disability, not necessarily that particular experience for you. Like that doesn't mean anything to, maybe it doesn't mean anything to you. It would mean not very much to me either. But for like a trans person, it would mean a heck of a lot for that question to be asked, right? Same as if you use identity first or person first. If somebody asks you, right? I have crippled and creative in my bio. I've let go of the idea that it matters to me what people refer to me as. But to somebody, who just got in a car accident 3 weeks ago and is trying to have their first interaction with, hey, how do I want to frame this to myself? And that question would be really important.
Yeah, acquired is way different.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you on that. And I hadn't really stumbled across that scenario before, and so I didn't know how to really answer it. And so when the person explained exactly what you just mentioned to me, John, and I said, oh, you know what? I said, I never even thought of that. And I'm learning, I said, as I go on with advocacy of really listening to people's viewpoints and understanding that it's okay to be who you are. It's okay to talk about your disability and like I'll just give you a quick little summary. Like for myself, like when I as I grew up as a little child, I used to walk in the walls. I would see double vision, and I had an eye surgery, and it left me with my condition. For me, on a scale of 1 out of 10, mine's at a 5. So it's not going to get worse. It's not going to get better. It's just going to stay stable, which unfortunately, because if I didn't have it, it would have stayed around probably around a 2, like 1 or 2. And I was scared. Like I still remember this vaguely, and I was scared because I go, well, how did I open up my door? Like I kept seeing 2 doors and this and that, and I had to learn how to balance myself, how to walk properly, because my balance is right off. And the doctors thought maybe I had cerebral palsy because I had all the indications of this, but it was because my for my peripheral vision, everything was off whack. And that's just who I am. And then as I grew older, I realized I'm just me, and I accept my disability. However, I was kind of ableist for a good while too for myself, where I didn't want to recognize it. Like I think, no, I just want to be like the rest of the kids, and and like for me, I would look at somebody straight, and my eyes, it left it with a astigmatism. So my eyes are
Sure.
constantly bouncing around. So if I'm talking to somebody, some people think, well, this, he's nervous. Like, oh, why are you nervous? Like, why are you not looking me straight in the face?
Right.
Well, I am, but it looks like you're, I'm not. And
yeah, blame my nystagmus. Thank you very much.
yeah. And so I, after a while, I thought, well, maybe if I just turn my head and go, oh yeah, or just keep talking to somebody, but keep turning my head away, and yeah, I'm listening to you, and just pretending that it's not there. And then I became, when I went to college, John, I even through high school and college, my instructors, or our teachers and then instructors, would then tell me it's okay. It's perfectly fine to be who you are, and you're accepted for who you are, Brent. Not judged on your disability, because if they judge you on your disability, then that's ableist. And I'm like, ableist. And as I got older, as advocacy, then what is ableist? Like, I started learning. And life's a learning puzzle, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, and I think it's a continual unpacking process. Like, I wrote a piece for an article for an outlet that I write for sometimes called Very Well Mind. And one of the pieces was about, and it's, sometimes as a journalist, there are a few pieces you write in your career that you find yourself continually sending around when somebody asks for advice. And it wasn't like an advice column. I wasn't, Agony Ant or whatever, but it was about
get out of here.
And Landers, yeah.
It was about grieving small function loss. So this idea that, like, we'll use CP as an example, seeing as all four of us have kindly presented that. That CP isn't conventionally known as progressive in the sense that, say, something like some forms of muscular dystrophy are. We're not talking about, like, our brain damage isn't going to descend, or whatever. But our muscles are under more strains, tone or lack of tone creates all these issues. And so, not everybody, but for a lot of disabled folks, there's the sort of the initial thing that we start with, or the initial loss in the terms of acquired. And then, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but how that sort of transpires over your lifespan. And oftentimes, like, for me, I can be the loudest out and proud whatever person sometimes, and sometimes that small, like, I used to be able to walk that far 3 years ago, and I can't anymore.
Yeah, me too.
Do I shove that in a little box inside of myself, or do I go to therapy? Do I decide to unpack that? And I think, disability community is, not that we haven't had space for this before, but I think, broadly speaking, is starting to understand that actually unpacking ableism is a lifelong endeavor. Because even if we're not, I mentioned the amount that intellectually and developmentally disabled people historically have been shoved to the side within disability activism. And that is a form of internalized and parallel ableism. So I think it's just continually,
It's interesting with ableism, and I guess maybe because I'm outspoken, and my parents always said I had kind of a mouth on me. Maybe it was the Monty Python upbringing. I don't know. But
the Ministry of Silly Wax.
I would get very sassy when I would go into, like, a training meeting, and it would be like someone from ODSP or ACE or whatever we want to PWD, and they would be meeting with an employer or someone that was doing the training, and it was like this whole ableist thing about, like, hi, I am actually in the room, like
we are not the wallpaper.
But it was interesting because I was having a conversation with my mom over Zoom, I think we were using, and we were talking about the upbringing and stuff. And I said, it's funny. I never really saw my disability when I was a kid. And she said, yeah, I know that. I said, it's really weird because my teachers would say, well, he works really hard, but he's not a very emotional person. He's very kind of quiet, and if you tell him something, he seems kind of cold. And this would I always just shrugged it off. But in last June, I did I did an assessment for DSO, which is Disability Service Ontario,
Hmm.
so that I could get access to the passport funding, and there was a chance of me getting into a assisted living type co-op situation. So my mom was really because and I get it, she's 80, and she's close to. Am I going to be around to see when he's 70? Probably not. And I'm 52 now. Um, so we did this whole assessment, and it took 6 weeks for the psychiatrist, and it was done at a place called Bethesda. So it was workers and the psych.
Yeah.
So it was a legit assessment, and one of the things they came up with is that I was on the autism spectrum, and it was like I never thought about it, but it explains so much. It really does. Like I
Yeah.
look back at all the nuances thing of how I interacted with professors in the college
Mhm.
and how I kind of dealt with people that were snobby and shallow, or
Sure.
how I approach learning, and people would be like, "Oh, well, he's not applying himself." Oh, I
Mhm.
am applying myself. It's just that my reaction to your information is different from the person next to me.
Yeah.
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 So it's really interesting. I think the sort of falls under that ableist uh, understanding of the nuance of disabilities.
Well,
Yep.
one thing I wanted to touch on is
Mhm.
and I wanted to get everybody's feedback on this one
Sure.
is you know how the comedians always say, if you're a really big comedian, they always say that they always feel they have to be on all the time. They have to be on and
Yeah.
funny all the time. And that's kind of what I've always like growing up, that like when you have a disability, you always feel like you have to be on all the time and present and like and we talked about having to try harder, like to prove yourself and like
To compensate.
you,
Yeah.
you felt like you couldn't have a bad day. And one of the things I wanted to bring in too is you know how, at least for me, I don't know if this is the case for everybody else here, but when I was younger, I think I was like 12 or 13. I got this and I think I've mentioned it before on the podcast. I got this calendar, a daily calendar. It was called the curmudgeon calendar, and one of the quotes on this curmudgeon calendar was from Charlotte Whitten. And if anybody knows who Charlotte Whitten was, she's credited as being one of the early feminists for Canada.
Right.
I believe she was in Winnipeg. She was a Winnipeg one of the first mayors there, or one of the first women mayors, I should say. And so she was credited as being like an early feminist for Canada. And one of her quotes is, you know, whatever a woman does, this is her quote, whatever a woman does, she must do twice as good as a man to be considered half as good. And then it's like,
Mm.
luckily, this isn't difficult.
Mhm.
And I realize that's from a feminist point of view, right? But when I remember reading that as a kid and thinking like, that actually applies to me. Like
Mm.
I saw that as like it's a feminist quote, right? But I saw that when I read that through a the disabled lens, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like
Right.
you could change the word and say whatever a disabled person does, they must do twice as good as an able body to be considered half as good. And then luckily that's not difficult, right? But that's how I saw that quote. And
Sure.
Mm.
and so I just wanted to see if kind of everybody has that same thing of always
Sure.
having to be on, or always having to prove yourself, or be
I
considered
think
like work twice as hard kind of thing.
sure. I think for me, I don't know. I moved to Canada when I was 11, so I can't speak to what I thought in the middle of the Midlands in England. But I think in Saskatchewan, one of my challenges, and again, the journalism hat is very much off in this statement, but we are who we represent. But if there's a pressure, let's put it this way, some of the advocacy processes that are celebrated in some parts of the country, more populous areas of the country, I have found for me, this is only speaking for me, do not work here. So in terms of, I cannot yell. I do not feel as if I can yell at somebody being incredibly ableist, because I've had many experiences where I wanted to, and then I found out that they had some connection to my personal or work life, right? Saskatchewan is a bigger province than most of Canada conceives it as in a lot of ways, but it ain't that big.
Yeah.
So
word gets around. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think some of this, you might hear the term tone policing sometimes, and I think a lot of the time that does happen, particularly to people who are on the part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community or BIPOC communities. Certainly tone policing happens from white dudes that look like me, ambulatory wheelchair users who can hide that they're disabled on a podcast like this if they wanted to. But I do feel that I have, over my years, and I'm still unpacking this, felt the pressure of and now I work for myself. It probably wouldn't have that much of an impact if I said what I thought sometimes. But it is do I have to perform the, do I want to be perceived as a bitter cripple in this moment when I go to the grocery store and somebody says, it's so nice to see you out? And I'm like, out of where?
Right.
Do I want to be
gee, thanks. I didn't want to people either, but here we are.
Yeah, and at some point, I have gotten to the point. I don't want to say I'm the opposite of you, Alan, but I was once thrown out of anger management classes for being too angry. And I've now gone the opposite end of the spectrum, if I may use that word, because if I get to a sort of conventional level of angry, I actually get more symptoms and more pain. So now I am 15-year-old me would not recognize me, not least of all because I've had 3 careers, but because most of the time I'm fairly calm. I'm animated, but I'm not, and sometimes I'm frustrated, but I don't hop over that barrier into anger very often. And Neil, maybe I need to talk about it in therapy, but I'm not sure. Maybe that is a response to having to always feel on. I think one of the joys of parasport when I was competing in it, and there's lots of things in parasport that aren't perfect, and lots of things in my experience of parasport that aren't perfect, is that when parasport athletes, generally speaking, talk to people outside of parasport circles, they use person first language, and there's lots of these conversations. And then you get in, particularly I played wheelchair basketball and wheelchair rugby, which are fairly, let's just say wheelchair basketball and wheelchair rugby athletes on the whole are very forward when they're talking about their disability to other disabled people, right? It's not insulting if somebody in a wheelchair basketball context, to me, of course it differs gym to gym, but if somebody goes, oh yeah, he's a spaz, yeah, okay, cool, right? In Britain, the big advocacy organization used to be called the Spastic Society, so I used to joke that I'm a card-carrying member of the Spastic Society. This is where my humor was sort of born in a way.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't mean that it makes it into my work 99% of the time, but it does mean that that gave me a cocoon in a way, I think, to figure out how I was in a disabled world. And that, like I said, I quit playing parasport and had to unpack a lot of those lessons. Some of them weren't useful, but a lot of the independency stuff and the when can you say what you want to say versus when can't you, was born there. But my high school years were not that. There's a lot of me saying what I thought and sort of paying the price for it, quite frankly.
But but it's interesting though, because I would never actually consider myself, I haven't really actually been an advocate for that long. I wouldn't call myself a quote unquote advocate really. I lived we were talking about disability porn earlier, and this idea that we somehow have to live up to a higher standard than we can't just be us. normal disabled people. We have to be at a higher standard somehow. And you know, I always kind of felt, even though I would never call myself an advocate, that even so, I always felt that it was kind of my duty to
Like you're representative of the wider whole.
to like not consciously, like it wasn't a conscious thing for me, but it was like it's my duty to represent myself in the best possible way so that people won't get this pissed off bad idea, but you know what I mean? And so like when, for example, when I would go for a job and start working, like I was always putting myself in the best possible way and secretly advocating for myself without really calling it advocacy, you know, but I was always putting myself out there and realizing that I was representing, like, because for example, like I might be the only guy, like maybe I know I was for the longest time. I was the only crip guy in the whole office. So
right.
So like I was the only guy that a lot of people would see for their whole existence. Maybe they would come in and work their 8-hour shift, and I was the only guy that they would see. So it carried a lot of weight for me, even though, like, again, I wasn't consciously advocating. I wasn't consciously going, oh, I have to really put myself out there. But I would just do that anyway, right? Just kind of naturally, right?
Yeah, like I think it gets to this, you know, it gets to this conversation, I think, Neil, about the distinction between an invisible and a visible disability. And there are lots of thought processes on this from lots of various different perspectives. I think where I've fallen on that scale in relation to what we're talking about is that you know, I can in very specific circumstances, given that I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, I can invisibilize my disability if I want to. Right. Now, I'm on a podcast and my name is Googleable, but you know, there is a version of, like, if I introduce myself to a new editor as a journalist, I can choose not to put disabled anywhere in the copy. I don't. In fact, oftentimes I put it in the subject line. But same as, you know, I can sit on a Zoom call and I can, you know, I unless the loud noise goes off, my CP is not particularly obvious. But although air horns were banned at my high school graduation, so I'm at fault for that one. There was a tradition and I got in the way of that because they didn't want me falling off the stage. But hence the air horn joke earlier. Come by it honestly. But you know, the same as Alan, if I may pick up on what you were saying, like you had a now I don't know you personally, but from what you shared thus far, fair to make maybe a little bit of a jump to people may see you as disabled and what we were talking about before the cameras turned on, but maybe not necessarily the autism or the neurodivergent side of things. And you know, some things that are remarkably obvious to other people are not obvious to ourselves. Like I have CP. I don't think I realized until I was like 23 that I had chronic pain. Now, duh. Yeah. Like remarkably obvious now, right? I didn't really understand until I was 27 or 28 and an autistic friend. Well, I was talking with an autistic friend as it happens. And I was talking about, you know, I feel neurodivergent, but I, you know, in terms of I have an anxiety and panic disorder and I have the CP, but like, how do I fit into the word neurodivergence comfortably without feeling like I'm taking space from others that label is meant for? And I said, John, you have cerebral palsy. You have a disability that is brain damage. What do you mean you're not neurodivergent? Yeah. like it's viewable on a brain scan. You know, they weren't quite as blunt as that. That's me sort of performing both of our bluntness put together. But, you know, there's so many things that we maybe don't notice. And I think it's the opposite of, you know, like I used to go to, I don't know about anybody here, but I used to go to family reunions and they'd say, oh, you're walking better. And it's like, well, actually, objectively, I'm walking worse. But
well for people that don't know, cerebral palsy, if you translate it, cerebral palsy means brain numb.
Yeah.
brain numb.
exactly.
That's what it translates into. So it's not the most flattering term, right? It means brain numb. So and I notice I have my friend Kent. I have my friend Kent in the chat right now. So that's kind of cool.
Oh, nice.
There you
Welcome,
go.
Kent.
Always nice.
Yeah.
Hi,
Yeah.
Kent.
It's so funny when I grew up, and obviously I had mild CP, which is, I mean, it's such a broad scale, right? I mean, you can be
Right.
someone like me that can get stopped by the cops because they think I'm drunk,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
To say someone like Neil Young's son who is nonverbal and in a wheelchair. So the CP spectrum is so wide. I
Mhm.
mean, um, but I mean, like, I'm so stubborn because I mean, like, when I was a teenager, I was riding 100cc motor dirt bikes. I mean, I was jumping ponds and swimming pools, and then when I moved to Toronto, I'm like hiking. I was doing everything that the doctors and my parents said, "Oh, I don't think you should do that." I was
Mm.
like,
Yeah.
I
No.
was just jumping around.
I knew somebody who was playing stand-up hockey and he only quit when stopping became mandatory, right? You know,
Oh.
it's all of these things that my physios in Britain probably hated me, but my goal was to play soccer. So I had to go to, you know, they wanted me to go to like the health and safety at the school because they
Mm.
were worried about me tripping people in my walker. I had to go to a soccer camp. I won most improved. Like in a lot of ways, you were talking about comedy routines earlier, Neil. I
Yeah.
think a lot of disability experiences, you know, there's two ways to read that, right? And some days you choose to read the version of your life that does read a little bit tragic.
Yeah.
I don't know the three of you all that well, but I get the sense that we've all told a story from our life that
I
we
see the
find
comedy
funny.
more. I see
Yeah.
the comedy more than I see
We
everything.
we tell a
Yeah.
story that we
Yeah.
find funny,
Yeah.
and you get the look across the table, and you're like, "Oh, that person, disabled or not, is not coming from the same wavelength, right?"
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I always say that people with a disability wear two kinds of armor. One is anger and bitterness, and the other is humor.
Mhm.
And I got way too much stuff from Monty Python to work off. So I guess humor is my armor.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is like for a lot of the people that I grew up with or are friends now, it's not that if I may borrow your beautiful metaphor, Alan, it's not that the bitter disabledness doesn't exist for that person. It's that we're very selective as to when we let it out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like if you got an average group of disabled people who are on disability support programs in this country and you left them to their own devices in a Zoom room, they would not come out as an optimistic bunch.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But you throw a couple of facilitators of these programs and they might sound a little bit more,
Yeah.
you know, whatever. It's the armor that we put on to feel like we can be presentable a lot of the times. And you know, you were mentioning, Neil, about, you know, your comfort level with the idea of being an advocate or an activist. And I must admit that when I was younger, I was a lot more comfortable with the label.
Mhm.
And then journalists by nature have a somewhat uncomfortable, a lot of the time, uncomfortable connection with the word activist because an active advocate because um it it denotes an idea of bias, perceived or real.
Yeah.
For me,
You can't be objective when you're doing a
for
project.
for me, the way that I frame that is that I try to frame my work as a journalist within a scope or a school of thought in journalism called solutions journalism. So the idea being that what you're writing has an end goal or can lead to better things or lead to other things. So oftentimes that other thing is more reporting in this area. That's certainly how I think about my parasport reporting, for example. In health reporting, the solutions often is a lot of these health outlets, they want to get information about these things that is digestible out to the masses. And that's how my relationship to the term has changed. Um, and I've also never, I don't know if anybody on this call, but even in disability advocacy spaces, I think there still is a bias towards the boots on the ground type of activism that we see and I think it's fair to say we can credit both in Canada and the US, things like in the US adapt, right? We've just passed the anniversary of the Capitol crawl.
Mm.
I think there is still a bias towards that as like the pinnacle of activism.
Yeah.
And for me, I've always felt like, and I continue to feel like my writing, even just existing, this can sound really egotistical, but that
It's allowed. It's allowed.
that if I conceive of
I
my
would say
writing, if I conceive of my writing as adding to the pile, and I conceive of my practice as a journalist as being as harm reductive as I can in the way that I interview and ask questions and etc., then I am living those skills that I gained when I was more advocate activism based. I don't, you're not going to see me on the front line of a protest. But I hope that within my writing, there is a sense when you come away from it that John took the time to think through and ask questions in a way that was equitable. Because I don't think we need any more stories that start with, because I've been a part of a few, and I'm not critiquing the journalists here, but where it's like the first line is John, who uses a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And it's not that
But
I don't
that-
use identity first language, but like you said, Alan, it's not if we're there to talk about chair maintenance, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah,
But if we're
it's the
there to
same
talk
thing with the
about
photography.
if we're there to talk about my theater degree, that can
Yeah.
wait till paragraph 2, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
You know-
it's good that you can use your pen or your typewriter or whatever I say as your sword, right?
My G Suite, my Google Docs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can use that as your sword and
Well,
take
yes,
up
but
your sword and shield
I-
and
I find
do the
with
fight that way.
with the advocacy, with the podcast, I've learned a lot over time, John, and I'm still learning. Like there's like so many stories that I've guests that come on talk about their stories, and I also look at like there's like not even like solution based, but ideas of where is that going to go to help a person for whatever their situation is. And when it comes to governments and stuff, like I don't know, it's just it seems like the same narrative. Like it's well, just get them a job, just get them a job, to get them off supports. I mean, that doesn't always work for everybody. Each individual person is different on how that may affect them or what. Just recently, I was at a rally in Victoria, downtown Victoria, at our legislature on the weekend. Not a lot of people turned out. It was pouring out, miserable day. But
Shocking! It was raining and breezy.
yeah, it is. Yes, exactly. And it,
And if you don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes.
exactly. But it brought the awareness. It was, Jack had recorded it live. We're gonna do more during the weekdays, here and there. When basically when the media is going to be available.
What was the protest around, if I may ask?
It was all around disability supports, bringing people up to no less than the poverty level. Not everybody has access to. I'll just kind of summarize it.
Sure.
Not everyone has access to subsidized housing. Many disabled people pay market rent. And in my view on the rally, and Jeff stands with it too, and is getting people to that level of income security. And when they need disability supports, I mean, their disability supports are above that level, but we get to that point where it's now tied to inflation, but now the opportunity of raising it up. But the government has the agenda. They've just introduced a Bill 7 in our legislature, which indicates that disabled people, there's no requirement for them to be job searching. It was
Right.
always in their legislation, though, but they just never enforced it in. They're going
Right.
after people on income assistance levels. However, they want to work with those individuals, not people with disabilities. So
Right.
now they're relaxing that. However, at the same time, they just don't. The people with disability don't have the supports to pay high market rent. Solution based, I think getting people up to a level, and so they have their needs met to have the kind of housing that they want. I came up with a solution-based idea where I want to see the rates tied to the individual in market housing, so that if they want to, they'll have the same idea as people
rather
in
than family unit, right? Rather than family
yeah,
unit.
yeah. I mean, based on the individual rather than the
Mhm.
household income,
Mhm.
so that it's based on autonomy, so that that person can make decisions based on their needs. So if they are living with, oh, I don't know, if they're living with some roommates and all of a sudden things go sideways, it's not based on the household, where now that person can walk away. They can now have their income. It's not, and they're not penalized. But the problem with
Right.
the subsidized housing programs, John, is that two people in a subsidized housing unit is now classified as one income. And so it can put people into a bad situation. Not
Right.
saying that it will. I mean, and I want people that are listening to this podcast now, I'm not saying that every situation is a bad situation. No. But I think that the person should have their own
They
ability
can
to
go
have,
sideways.
yeah,
That
they
it
have their
can
own
go
ability to
sideways.
make their own decisions based on their own needs rather than what the
Yeah.
government needs are. And I'm hammering that home all the time, because nobody should have to sacrifice certain things and not be able to make decisions for themselves and live where they want. So like, yeah, I mean, like I say, I've learned a lot with advocacy. I never used to be an advocate at one time. I saw so many holes in the system that I thought, okay, well, what can I do is bring awareness to the problems. And I don't have all the solutions. And I know I was criticized for a while there. Well, no, you're just putting people, all these other ones on a pedestal, and you have all the ideas. No, I don't have all the ideas.
Yeah.
I learned from people.
Right.
I'm fine saying I know nothing. I'm fine saying
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
I've often said within, especially the disability arts work that I've done and sometimes continue to do, is that I continue to be uncomfortable with the term expert.
Mhm.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's because of the anxiety and panic disorder, and I've just sort of extended it to, I can't sometimes be trusted with my own sort of memory of an experience, let alone being an expert on, all wheelchair users or all class 2 wheelchair basketball athletes or whatever. But I think what you're speaking to, Brent, too, and I've done some reporting for Briar Patch and the SAS Dispatch, which are two local leftist publications, expressly leftist publications. I say that because, putting things on a spectrum can be challenging in the media market, but I think it's fair to say that's where those two lie. About barriers for benefits, it was around SAID, Saskatchewan Assured Income for Disability,
Mhm.
and CERB payments and barriers and things like that. And what strikes me whenever the benefits conversation, it struck me when I was an athlete and I wasn't a journalist, and it strikes me again as I write about these things, is that while social media has in a lot of ways opened this up, it's challenging to have a nuanced conversation about benefits across provinces. Because,
Mhm.
for example, SAID, and I'm not speaking for people on SAID. I've never been on SAID. This is not, this is one viewpoint of one tiny piece of SAID. SAID does not meet for many people the income needs that they have. Saskatchewan also, for a certain segment of disabled folks, has a very good version of a pharmacare program called the Para program because names, right? So we can look at that and we can say, I always give the example of this in ODSP, and sorry, Alan, as the person on ODSP, you are freely aware, you're more than welcome to shoot me down on this, but we can talk about, we often look at the dollar number, right? And that's often where the conversation ends. Not in community I'm talking about, but when it expands past community.
Mhm.
But the radical differences between Saskatchewan's version of an equipment program and Ontario's, or the differences in what makes you eligible and what doesn't. Like, there are so many nuances that it's really, forget apples and oranges. Like it can be very challenging, and it's hard to get.
I call it cherry picking. Actually, the policies are cherry picking because they say
unicorn?
that you as a disabled person deserve subsidized housing, and you as a disabled person over here do not deserve subsidized housing. Like it
Yeah.
plays off disabled
they-
versus disabled all the
Yeah,
time.
they play against each other.
They
Yeah.
play against each other
Right,
all
like
the time.
I don't know if this is still true, so people can fact check me. When I did that reporting, which was 4 years ago, so things change, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
AISH had the highest dollar number.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it still does. Yeah.
I do.
The UCP
Well-
de-indexed them from inflation. So
Mhm.
right there you have, okay, this is it now, but as inflation continues to rise, how does, these are all things, and including when I was doing that reporting, it was very challenging to get any kind of even simple dollar number for some of the provinces and territories.
Mhm.
And so this is to say that I think while social media has added to what advocates do across borders,
Mhm.
it's still incredibly challenging to have a sort of cross-border conversation, never mind cross-border with our friends to the south,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
I wrote a piece for Teen Vogue. Notably, I am not a teen, but Teen Vogue has a lot of sort of they've trended towards a lot of sort of these conversations that we have in community within various communities. And I wrote about medical assistance in dying, and the piece was about what American advocates and activists could learn or should think about. And Rebecca Coakley, one of the biggest, one of a large voice in American disability advocacy, and I don't have the piece in front of me, but the general line from Rebecca was, we need to learn to, listen a little bit more. And I think that that is also a lesson that I'm hearing more and more from people in advocacy spaces in Canada, that we can get very insulated into what does it mean to be disabled in, Saskatoon or Burnaby, or I'm just going to pick a town, Kitchener.
Yeah.
We can do that, but does it the same way as parasport culture, disability culture in Vancouver looks different than it does in Ottawa. And that's a feature, not a bug. So how is that presented, and how do people feel about that is really, what I'm
CP is
interested
a feature.
in learning about.
My CP is a feature.
Interesting.
Well,
Very interesting.
I was thinking that, this may be a bit in the weeds, and I'm not saying that, being quad is a feature, not a bug, but when I see, and occasionally they'll kick around, right, these videos of spinal cord injury quads. Look at me using parasporting words, but using their spasms to walk from the door to get their wheelchair out of their truck, right? And you go, oh yeah, there's some adaptation. There's where we've taken something that can be a pain, quite literally, and turned into something we do. But the danger, like we talked about earlier, is turning that into inspiration. Within community, we don't see that as inspiring. We see that as, cool, wonder if that works for me. It's not like I'm going to go rush and put him on a poster, right? Or put like that one with the kid with the running legs that says, your excuse is invalid.
Yeah.
No, to me, that photo says your excuse is incredibly valid, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, let's talk about, there are many times in my life where I said I couldn't do something. And I think we're rushed a little too quickly when we talk about disability communities, say, oh, no, you can't do that. Like, cool, I could wheel a marathon. I can't run a marathon. It's okay for me to say I can't run a marathon. It's okay to say that I used to be able to walk however far, and now I can probably only walk, I don't know, a couple of kilometers if I pushed it real hard. I think for me, and just tying it back to our identity conversation, that's where I am, is that I'm growing to try to be more okay with what I can't do. Whereas the first 25 years of my life, I'm coming up on 31, we're very, I can do anything. Because it takes an I can do anything attitude to have a plan to be an NHL hockey goalie when you're
Yeah.
Class 2 wheelchair basketball, CP, like that. I'm eligible to play wheelchair rugby and did play, albeit as a 3-5. I'm not.
Yeah,
Um,
I have to say that it was when
Okay.
I turned about 30 years old, and like prior to about 30 years old, I was always pushing myself and saying, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, and
Mhm.
ignoring my disability like there was no tomorrow. And then when I got to about age 30, I had this light bulb go from my head saying, you know what, it's okay to just be average, to just
Yeah.
be just be sufficient. Like
I was,
I don't have to knock it out of the park every single time. Like
Yeah.
I
Just
used
being
I
you.
was,
I used to think that I had to knock it out of the park every single time. Like every day I woke up, I had to knock it out of the park. I have to knock it out of the park. I have to
Yeah.
knock it out of the park.
Yeah.
And then I
but
got
I
to,
want to,
and
I
then
want
it
to
was
touch on that.
30. It was like
Sure.
I don't have to do that anymore.
Okay.
I
Go
want
ahead.
to touch on that, Brent, because
Yeah.
like just because I've been an athlete and especially as a photographer, um, for years, like even when I was in Toronto or even when I was in Niagara and I would go to Toronto or something when I was using a film camera, I had this stubborn drive that I would walk like 5 miles each way and that would be it. And I would do it over and over, no matter what direction I'd go. And it's like I don't need a bus, I don't need a transit. I'm gonna walk from downtown Yonge Street all the way to Kensington Market, which is a good hour and a half hike.
Mm.
And on top of that, I'd have a camera bag on my back with a tripod and everything. I'd be like loaded down, right? And I do that hike. And now I was like yesterday when I went out for a hike to take some photos, I got to a certain point and I was like, you know what? I'm done. I'm riding the bus home.
Yeah.
You kind of get to that level where you're going, no, I'm done. There's another
Yeah.
4 hours of trail ahead of me, but we're stopping here because that's it.
Yeah.
I'm done.
And,
You know,
and I don't know about for
You
you.
know that you just have to get to that point where you say the mind over body, mind over matter, right?
well,
Because
that
your mind will say, yeah.
my mind over matter was actually becoming to the point where I was like going really far from home,
Mhm.
like within the city, to like I was walking distances that people that weren't disabled wouldn't even try.
Oh,
Like, you know what I
I
mean? And I had this stubborn like,
yeah.
I don't need the TTC.
Well,
We're going for 4 hours.
Ellen, is I remember like many years ago now. I mean, how time goes by in life. Um, I um, I participated in a track and field, and I was against some real good, real good athletes at the time. And I'm not saying that I was better or they were better. No, I did the best I could. But for some reason, it was I don't know I guess I don't know balance was off or I don't know what was going on. But I trained really hard for it, and the mind said, Brent, you can do this, you can do this, and I just pushed myself. And I remember going around this one bend, you guys, and around this track, and all of a sudden the ankle, it seized up. All of a sudden I'm like, oh, it is pain, and I just said, nope. My mind says, Brent, ignore it, keep going, and I pushed myself. I got a silver. I got a silver. I almost the other guy beat me by about 4 feet. 4 feet. He beat me, and he got the gold.
Wow.
But I pushed myself. I was in so much pain when I got done. And they asked me, "Are you okay? Okay, yeah, I'm fine." Did I? Yeah, but I felt like I was gonna fall over, but it mind over matter. But yeah, I mean, I guess put my mind. I guess moral of the story is I really put my mind to it, saying that yeah, I could do this. And I trained really well, and I enjoyed it though, because it showed that for me, I could accomplish something, and I felt it felt so rewarding. Like yay, like I accomplished this. Yes, to admit, I mean, I wish I could have got the gold, but then I found out afterwards I should have got the gold.
Oh,
Right.
The other person, yeah, actually, I would have won. The other person, unfortunately, took steroids. So, yeah, and so
Right.
the person beat me. I found out after, and I just said, you know what? I'm actually happy. I'm actually happy. They're like, no, no, you can have the gold. No, no. If he feels he wants to have it that bad, then fine. Let them have the.
I
victory.
feel like, like you said, Brent, there are still times, and I couldn't tell you where it comes from. It could be parasport, it could be whatever, where I will have to do something and I will literally say out loud, okay, I'm turning off the pain valve now.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
difference is, when I was younger, I saw that as a good thing.
You could just
Mhm.
ignore it,
As I'm
right?
ol-
Yeah.
And now
Yep.
as I'm older, I see it as a sacrifice. Like, it's a good thing that I can still do it.
Yeah.
In those moments, but I'm far more selective. I mean, I had teammates that played with broken feet,
Hmm.
like in a contact wheelchair sport.
Yeah.
These are not decisions, that are always all that sensible. And
Oh, I left sensible a long time ago.
yeah, well, and like, there were, I think, Alan, what my brain went to when you were talking about, going far further than even any non-disabled people would care to go, is that, like, I used to think maybe, oh, well, I don't know, can't really prescribe what I thought at 12, but, like, I used to think, like you were saying, Neil, that almost felt expected of me, or at least it was
Yeah.
rational to think it was expected of me. I don't think
Yeah.
I ever, like, did one of those goofy things and said, like, a goofy in terms of, like, going up a big, like, wheeling up a big trail in the mountains when my family would go to BC or whatever. But now I'm like, occasionally I'm like, let's see if I can do that again.
Mhm.
Instead of, oh, I need to prove that I'm still that abled.
Yeah.
Like, many years ago, I participated in a fundraiser, and years ago, it's actually for one of the outlets that I wrote for. Their fundraiser was a swimathon. Now,
I
when I
did
was a
that.
kid,
Yeah.
in Britain, I was told by the para swimming coach where I grew up that I would be a better swimmer if I didn't have legs.
Oh,
Like, that's how not great of a swimmer.
yeah.
They're like, forget your legs exist. And I was like, well, spasms are a thing. That's a slight problem. I managed to get a medal in my one ever swim meet, because we were swimming in a pool that was far too cold, and all the other competitors had CP. And so it was too cold for most of them. And I managed to just have enough function, along with me and two amputees, to be able to finish the silly thing. So I went and did a swimathon, and before I got into the swimming pool, I said to the person who was there as the I was about to call him the umpire, the lifeguard. I said, just so you know, I'm gonna look like I'm drowning. I'm not drowning. And athlete me, this was like, I was probably 26. So athlete me, so like 21-year-old me, 20-year-old me, would have been like somebody that was swimming with us, like, her kid was swimming with us. Like, 20-year-old me would have been mad, even though the kid was able-bodied, that our kid beat the living daylights out of how many laps I did. And I was just happy that the lifeguard didn't jump in thinking I was drowning, right?
Yeah.
Like, for me, it's how can we change our relationship to, like, disability happiness?
Yes. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean we have to be happy all the time. We
No.
can be better all the time. I totally understand. Like, when the people that I used to think were old, bitter crips when I was like 15, trust me, at 31, I understand why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Because they, whatever. I understand now that for many of them, they go out through things that I, maybe couldn't even imagine now.
Yeah.
So
What I was going to say is that we've actually, I've been looking closely at the time, and we have actually blown past the time. This has been a great conversation.
sounds like
So I didn't want to stop it, but we should be wrapping up now, Brent.
Yeah, this has been a fabulous episode. It's been a great pleasure, John, for having you on. I'd
You
love
could do
to
a part two,
have
maybe.
you
two,
back
yeah.
on soon.
Yeah.
what
should
did you
do a
say
part
the
two,
last
maybe.
part, Brent?
Oh, I'd love to extend the offer to have you come back on in the very near future here.
Yeah, it was fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Happy to speak with you.
Yeah.
And happy to speak with you once the mics are off.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's so many great stories of what we've gone through so far in life, right? And just to kind of recap different scenarios and one thing that always stood out to me was when I was just a, oh geez, I was what, 12 or 13. One of my neighbors had said, how come you're wearing glasses? How come you can't be like us? And I went, I'm just me. I don't know. I'm just wearing glasses. So I said, I came up with a funny joke. I said, well, I've got four eyes instead of two because I got glasses. Now I got two other eyes. I go, I can see
Now I
things
can see
that
you're
you
a bad
can.
dresser.
I said, I can see things better than you.
I knew somebody who their sibling was always mad that because younger sibling was mad that the older sibling got to do things, and
Mhm.
the older sibling had CP and the younger sibling didn't. And the joke was that the one of the parents used to joke that it was that every parent got a manual for their kid, and because the kid was CP was premature, that didn't finish the
Yeah.
manual yet.
Oh,
So
Right.
so they could it was in his manual that he couldn't do it, but the older sibling could because the manual hadn't been finished. And sometimes I think that's a nice framing of life of like,
Mhm.
like, oh, the manual, the ableist society says that we have to do X. But and that's going to sound very inspo-y, but I
Mhm.
even mean it in terms of that manual says we have to be like happy-go-lucky,
Yeah.
and we can't
Nope.
have a bitter cripple moment.
We deserve to have off days every once in a while. Like
Exactly.
like
Yeah,
I was
right.
saying with the comedian, like I shouldn't always have to feel like I have to be on all the time, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
If people want their safety from me, I better have coffee in my hand. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. Cup of Joe right here.
I was like, I
Coffee,
cannot,
isn't it like
I cannot guarantee your safety unless I have caffeine at me, and it comes from coffee. So
Tread with caution.
Yeah.
well, what's the joke that I've heard so many times in parasport circles and outside of them? This is not a serious directive, but just wheel over their toes.
Yeah.
And I don't do that specifically, but I think that sometimes the ways that advocacy and activism and even disability-led journalism exist in the world are to wheel over those toes sometimes.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's a good way of actually putting it. Sometimes it's maybe like kind of showing the issues of like telling society like it's okay, like wake up and realize that people are just who they are. And they just live their life and just recognize the person for who they are, not as well. They have to be like superior, like look at me, like I have a gold medal, or hey, I mean
Or
those
a silver.
Yeah.
I'm
or
pretty,
silver.
Yeah.
Look at me, like
Yeah.
hey,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
But
pretty calm. I think the only thing, if I get hit with ableist attitude, you know, um, I kind of become a bit of a jerk. But I'm kind of like, you knew you were doing it. So
right.
what do you think my reaction would be? Like, awesome, buddy, high five. No, I'm gonna
Yeah.
call you a dick for it.
Right, and
And
that's when
Yeah.
and I'm aware that I'm pulling us past time again. So Neil, I'll pass it to you right after what I say, but I think that's when we retreat to community.
Yeah.
When we retreat to the people, and I think what I try to be cognizant of in my personal life is there are so many examples, disability community or not, of people kicking open doors and shutting at them behind them.
Mhm.
And going, well, disabled people haven't gotten this right, so I'm going to fight for, this monetary opportunity, or I'm going to gatekeep this information or this email or whatever. And I think the fact that we retreat to community to sort of lick our wounds, as it were, or maybe we go on podcasts and yell about it, who knows? That can be, a way forward for ourselves in our own personal lives. But anyway, to Neil.
Yeah.
Well, actually, to Brent, you
to
have
Brent.
to you have to
Yeah.
go off. You have to get us
Yeah.
off the show, Brent.
Yeah, I
it's
have
your
to.
job to get us off the show.
It is.
Okay, fair enough. Sorry,
But,
Brent.
you know, I want to thank you, John, and
You're
Alan, for Alan for you co-hosting. But John, first of all, I want to thank you for coming on to the show, and for Alan to be my co-host. And you might end up filling in every so often, Alan, to be the host. In the upcoming near future. So stay tuned on that one. But thanks, John, and I'll have you back on again soon. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks
Thanks for
everyone for
having me.
tuning in today.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.